When we talk about this thing called loss analysis, what does that mean to you in the supply chain?
It's a pretty interesting way to say, here's a structured, data-based approach to finding losses, but it's really, in a layman's term, the opportunity to say, what's my ideal state? We all have metrics, we all have KPIs, and that measures our output. But loss analysis really allows us to look inside of our processes and inside of what we do from a people, finance, and material perspective and say, how do we get the most out of this to deliver the outputs that we're trying to achieve?
Why don't you start with savings targets?
Savings, like most of what we're used to doing in operations and manufacturing and supply chain, is about what we know today and incrementally, how do we want to get better? What do we want to deliver to the business is what savings targets is usually driven on. Loss analysis is really about what's the best case scenario. Savings are never versus ideal. They're usually versus what we think we can deliver or what we want to deliver. It's against a known baseline. A distribution center might be hitting their OTIF, but they're spending a lot of money in overtime to make that happen. So that's a loss in and of itself. It's all this extra labor that you're spending. Or again, you're hitting your own time for trucks, but the trucks are not 100% cubed out. Those types of things are losses that don't necessarily neatly show up on the P&L, but they are in the P&L because they're part of the cost of delivering that business.
Where are the big losses in your experience in the multiple companies that you've applied loss analysis to?
Well, if you take away the big catastrophic ones we've had in the last 10 years, like, COVID, the closing of the Panama Canal, the bombing of a few ports and those types of things, today's world is really about economic volatility, even, inventory, our levels of inventory and human capital. Economic volatility really looks at surges in business. Orders come today, you got 20 orders, tomorrow you got 50 orders, and how do you react to those types of things? People delaying orders back and forth. So if your forecast variability goes kaput because the customers can't accurately forecast because tariffs come in, and so people stop ordering and you have to raise prices. So what you thought you were going to sell, you can't sell, those types of things. There's another piece of that economic volatility that really looks at the finance, which we don't talk a lot about in supply chain, but in order to get an order out the door, there's probably 3 touches on the finance side that if someone puts in the wrong price or the wrong quantity or the wrong weight, your order's totally wrong. And because they're juggling all the finances, they don't always catch that. They don't always do the full screening on the orders themselves. Economic volatility actually touches all what we call handoffs in the business. Wherever there's a handoff of information, product, or services inside of your facility, the impact of financial and economic volatility shows up.
You got any examples from your career that would say, hey, this is an area of economic volatility that's really hurt us over the long run?
We had a picking operation where we had 250 individuals building pallets. And every day we gave them an order sheet and said, go pick. We had a crew that was set up for 150 orders a day, right? And we consistently had a range around that was somewhere between 100 to 300. We ended up jostling crews and bringing in temporaries and all this other stuff. And once we really dug into it and figured out, okay, our trucks are leaving on time. We're putting the stuff on there that our customers are ordering, but how do we do this differently? Because we're spending a boatload of money. And we figured out how to do efficient assortment and efficient ordering and efficient pallet building. Now, when a picker went to a location to build a pallet, instead of going to get small cases and light cases and building a pallet that was eventually going to fall over and damage, they picked up larger boxes that allowed them to build a more stable pallet. Once we were able to figure that out, we actually were able to reduce the number of crews and still be able to flex up with the variation in the orders. We were also able to reduce the damage and reduce the fatigue that we were seeing on the actual pickers in the floor. And net, we saved about $2.5 million, and our safety improved as well as we were able to reduce our staff by 20%. So those types of scenarios show up all the time. One other quick one for you is just SLOB inventory or in inventory itself, because as your forecast variability changes, depending upon your go-to-market strategy, you can end up buying inventory to cover for that variation at times, and that inventory ends up being shrink, waste, or damage. We took the data that looked at, and once we were able to understand the mechanics of each of those items, we were able to put in a very defined process that said, here's the delegation of authority for individuals ordering inventoriable items, what they can purchase and what their limits were. So we reduce the amount of product that actually showed up in the warehouse. And then we made a defined process on donations. And then we also looked at accountability around what's the definition of SLOB, when can we actually call it SLOB. And then we actually said, here's the process by a product can actually walk its way through our inventory and then become slow and obsolete inventory and how we handle it. And just putting that process in place, we were able to save about $3 million. Now, the reason we built inventory was because we were looking at how do we service the customer given that volatility, and we didn't think about how best to do that. We just thought about the outcome.
You're meeting your service targets. You used OTIF, on time in full, before. We're meeting that target. How do you account for I'll call it the cost associated with doing that and the losses associated with forcing yourself to meet 100% OTIF?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you typical KPIs, they measure output, and we get rewarded on output as leaders in our businesses. So it's a common thing. But what we have to think about as real leaders, if we really want to be change agents in our business, if we really want to get to world class, it is about those in-process things that help you deliver the output. Losses themselves are rooted in the how. And so once you start to think about that, service targets and all these other things, and you start to say, am I expediting orders a lot? Am I running overtime? Am I, going to a backup carrier and paying more money than I should for that lane because volatility in the forecast? Those types of things get buried, and you have to start to want to actually get to a place where you're, I want to say perfect in order to see them. And then that helps you reduce your costs, improve your service, and improve your efficiency. How
do you see them? How do you make those costs visible so that they, I won't say smack you in the face each day, but you know what I mean? It's amazing. It's amazing what you can hide and ignore if it's hidden, right? Yeah, because you have to start with the real desire to improve. And the reason I say this is because if you're sitting there and you're being rewarded because your OTIF is great and you've improved your OTIF year over year, there's no impetus for you to look at how you're doing that to make it better because you're achieving what you believe is the reward. And so in order to do that, you have to start saying, where do we have an upset? How often do we have upsets? Where do we have to intervene in the processes? And then start to measure those, in time, money, and effort. Start to say whether is this something that happens all the time? Is this something that happens once a month? Is there any type of rhyme or reason around this loss? There's some losses that you'll look at and say, it's too costly to deal with, but still categorize it as a loss so that you at least know that it's there and you can make a conscious choice around it. But in order to see it, get a cadre of folks, a cross-section of folks, and start talking to folks around, what is it that makes your job harder? What makes your job longer? What makes your job complex? And then start to look at how do you remedy those things for those individuals. And then once you do that, then you start to categorize them and analyze them. And that data analysis will bring those losses off the page for you because now you can dimensionalize them. How did you learn to do that? Where was what was the impetus that said, geez, I need to look at things that everyone else is ignoring? Honestly, it was a trial by fire. When I was at Procter and I was running the warehouse, and even when I was at Pepsi and we were loading trucks and we were hitting our OTIFs, the leader kept coming back and saying,
because you're spending more money, and your indexes are not good on the profit side. It forced me to switch my thought process from being just an operator to a business leader. And once that light bulb switched for me, I started to say, why is that? Why am I spending so much money? And then I pulled back and started to look. And there are two types of losses for me as I started to really get into it. One of the real obvious ones are any deficit from your expectation. But then there's the hidden ones or the inverted ones. And then you can see it clearly in like sales. In sales, you hire a hunter to go get you a bunch of business. But that same salesperson also has to process the orders and process all the customer information. But if you don't think about the fact that every moment that salesperson is processing that order and downloading that customer information, there's a sale that they are not getting, you just lost that opportunity on the loss. That's the hidden loss. It's similarly when you think about loading trucks, right?
You went from being an executor, a person who just made things happen, to being a business leader, and that served you pretty well through your career. Clearly, this whole loss analysis thing works for you.
It does. I tell people today, and the things that I learned in P&G and Pepsi around loss analysis are serving me today. I don't always do them in complete these loss analysis in the very formal process that I did at the start of my career. Today, because of understanding the business, you can see a lot of these things by just analyzing the data and the financials. It's not that everybody's running, have to be ripping and running and frantically moving about, but there's a pace in which people and business should work.
Experience does add to a lot. If you know where the bodies are buried, they're pretty easy to dig up, right?
Exactly.
And you've obviously seen where the bodies are buried. If I was a leader, and what's the biggest watch out? What are the mistakes that I can make in this whole thing? And really, how do I get this off the ground, for want of a better term, without making those mistakes?
Well, the first thing really as a leader is you have to have a commitment to change. The worst thing you can do, the absolute worst thing you can do, is to start this process and do nothing. And as a leader, the burden of action is extremely high when you have engaged your organization. Once you've cleared that hurdle mentally and you've convicted yourself to we're going to change for the better, then you have to start that interview process. You have to start to talk to folks, cross disciplines, to say, what is it that's holding us back? Whatever it is that allows you to dimensionalize the issues that the individuals are speaking to you about, you need to do that. Now, one of the things for me that is a simple tool is just doing some takt time measurements. And takt time, it's a funky word, but it's really just looking at the time it takes people to do things. And there's a symmetry if you have a manual task between the rate that the line can move or the rate that the process can move and the interaction time of the employee. And once you're looking at that, you'll say, hey, let's say a person's putting a cap on a bottle, and that person, in order to do that, it takes 2 seconds. And the dwell time that bottle stays in front of that employee is 10 seconds. So in theory, that person can do 5 caps. And depending upon the line speed, you might only need one person. But you have to look at it at that discrete level to really decide, do you need 3 people or do you need 4 people? As opposed to the typical thought process, you put enough people over there so folks feel comfortable. And that might mean that you're overstaffed in that location. But that's what I would tell folks as leaders. One, have a conviction to change, interview people to understand where your losses are, where the pain points are, combine that with the data, and then start to highlight where those are and measure those, and then illuminate that back to the organization, and then develop your prioritized plan on how you want to implement.
I really think this has been really interesting. And there's some things that I've picked up from, what we measure as outputs, not necessarily understanding the edge conditions and the handoffs in the system, the all-important commitment to change, because a lot of people have real difficulty with that one, and I'll call it managing the process with takt time and how you actually get things to flow from one place to another without that volatility and having a standard pace. I don't know that I've done a very good job in summarizing all the things, but I think it's been a good session, and I certainly appreciate it. I know you're on LinkedIn, so I'm sure people will send you notes if they have questions.
Yeah, for sure.
But certainly appreciate your time today. Thank you. I appreciate everybody who's listening in, watching. As is part of an education series where guys like Tony and I are trying to give back to the supply chain community, which has frankly been very good to me, and I think it's been good to you too, Tony.
I was saying, just as people have questions and comments, again, feel free to reach out. As Tom said, it's about giving back and helping people get better. And if you can learn from my pain, by all means, do that. And thank you very much, Tom, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tony.